All right, welcome everybody to the Modeling Visible and Non-Visible Content inside of Contentful, presented by yours truly. There is absolutely no prior knowledge of Contentful or content modeling required at all. I am Marcelo Lewin, and there is my email address. Feel free to email me anytime with any questions you have. I gladly will answer them. I'm a content creator. You can check out my site, themarcelolewin.com. I'm also a senior e-learning manager for a company called Service Titan. I do want to remind you that we have a meetup. Of course, that meetup, we're not meeting in person right now because of the obvious reasons with COVID-19, but we will meet. Feel free to join there. As soon as things go back to normal, we will start meeting up in Glendale, California. For those of you that can't meet because you're not local, still join because I make announcements through there. I also make announcements for the webinars and videos and a whole bunch of other stuff. So just go to meetup.com/contentful and register. Also, I have a podcast. You can subscribe many different channels. Just visit anchor.fm/contentful-creators. And then you can pick to subscribe via iTunes and Spotify and a whole bunch of others. Also, I share all of this content as well in my YouTube channel. So just feel free to go to that YouTube channel and you'll be able to watch this on demand as well there, plus tutorials and other things. And of course, I have a blog. Just go to this URL and you'll be able to read any Contentful related blogs, but I also have other kinds of blogs as well. And of course, if you just forgot all of those URLs, don't worry. Just remember this one, contentfulcreators.com. That's going to drop you in my website. That'll show you links to everything I just mentioned. Just remember contentfulcreators.com and you'll get to visit all those links that I just mentioned. So here's the agenda. Part one, we're going to do an overview, basically, and we're going to talk about what modeling is, what content modeling is, what it isn't, or what it shouldn't be. We're going to go through some vocabulary, so that way we're all on the same page. We're going to talk about building your team. We'll talk about what your objectives should be at a minimum. And then we'll talk about creating your content governance and what that is. You'll know when we go through the vocabulary. Part two is going to be a demonstration. And we're going to analyze an actual release notes knowledge-based article, which I just went through in my company. I'm going to show you how I went through the brainstorming phase and how we created that new structure. Then we're going to create an ERD, an entity relationship diagram. And that's for those of you that are developers or database designers, that's really related a lot with database, but it really helps out a lot in figuring out relationships. Then I'm going to show you how I created the Contentful content object model, not inside of Contentful, but in a chart before putting it in Contentful. Then we'll figure out some of the constraints of these content types, and you'll know what content types are in just a minute, but we'll figure out some of those constraints. Then we'll create the content model inside of Contentful, and then we'll see the content model in multiple delivery channels. Now, you're not going to see them in the real delivery channels. I have mockups, but it'll give you a really good idea of what you can do. So what is content modeling? Content modeling is the process of analyzing and breaking down a document, right? Pretty simple. For example, a document could be a web page. It could be a knowledge-based article. It could be anything. It could be maybe you have a survey on your site and you want to break that down and create a content model around it. It could be any kind of content that is represented to the end user. You can build a content model out of that. Now, you want to take that document and break it into a well-structured objects that can be used to rebuild that document. So it's funny because you start with a document, then you break that document into objects, then you use those objects to rebuild that document. And you'll understand why you want to do that. It's really powerful, the reason you want to do that. But for example, if we have, let's say, a blog article, the blog article in itself is an object, the whole blog article, but within it, it could have multiple objects. Like, for example, it could have a blog author object. It could have an SEO object. It could have a media object. It could have a variety of different kinds of objects with it. Content modeling is also the building of the relationship between objects. So for example, sticking with the blog article, if we have a blog author, we can create a blog author object and then say, hey, all blog articles have an author, or all blog articles may have multiple authors. So we build a relationship between the blog article content type or the object and the blog author content type or object. Content modeling is also the creation of attributes and constraints on those objects. So for example, if we stick with the blog author object, we would have like an author name and email. Those would be some of the attributes, right, that describe that object. But on top of that, we can have constraints. So for example, we can say the name, we don't want any more than 20 characters long. Of course, that would be a silly thing to put on an author name because people have different lengths for their names. But as an example, that's an example of a constraint that you can put on a field. So building a content model is breaking that document into objects, creating relationships, and then figuring out the attributes of all those objects and constraints of those attributes. And what's really important, I should make this bullet item super big, is the complete separation of layout and design from the content itself. So when you're modeling content, you're modeling content. You're not modeling layout, you're not modeling design. And I know if you read some of the documentation Contentful, they do talk a little bit about layout, and you'll see where it actually does come into place in Contentful. But in general, I want you to walk out of here thinking when we're building a content model, we're focusing on the information, not on design here, because a lot of people start with design. Oh, what is it going to look like? We don't want to talk about that. The end product of a properly designed content model should be raw and reusable content that can be easily manipulated and delivered via any channel, regardless of layout and design. So as an example, here are some documents that have been broken down, let's say, right? They've been structured and created a content model out of it. I can then take the content in that document, the raw content in that document, and deliver it to the browser and display it in one way in the browser. I can then take that same piece of content and deliver it to the mobile device and display it in a completely different way. But wait, there's more. I can then take that content and go, you know what? I want to build an Alexa skill, which obviously you're not going to have any kind of design elements, right? You're not going to have bold. You're not going to have centered or any of that kind of stuff because Alexa is going to end up speaking that. So that's why it's so important to separate that content from layout and from design, because in some places, the layout doesn't make sense or design doesn't make sense, for example, in Alexa. So what is not content modeling? And we go back to this. Design. This is not a chance for you to figure out what is my new website going to look like. That's not what content modeling is. It's all about the content, the information in there. Now, having said that, you can use your new designs or your new prototypes that you've created to figure out that the content model you're creating supports the data that that design needs. So for example, if you're switching websites and you're adding some fields in the new design, then you want to know that the content model will be able to support that design by providing the content it needs to populate in that design. But that is very different than saying, okay, let's design the website. This is more like, okay, let's make sure our content supports all of these delivery channels, current or future ones. Also, you shouldn't use this content modeling time to figure out the context to support. In context, I mean, and you'll see in the vocabulary, like, should we support mobile? Should we support Alexa? Should we support? That has nothing to do with this. Again, we're all focusing here on content. The context, the design, the layout, that'll come in much later. But if we have a good content model in place, designed properly, it'll scale to anything in the future. So let's talk about some vocabulary. Let's start defining some stuff. We have content. That's the combination of words and media assets that describe or conveys information to a user. Notice there's nothing here about design, about layout. Most, if not all, will be in Contentful, right? Most of this stuff will be in your Contentful. And I say most because you may have some content that may be hard-coded, and you may have some content that may be pulled from other systems, right, that may populate that content. So not everything will be in Contentful, but most of your content will be in Contentful. Layout. That's the position and order of how your content will be displayed in a delivery channel. It's not how it's going to look. It's just a position and the order of display. And part of this may be in Contentful. And when we get into assemblies, you'll understand why I say part of this may be in Contentful, but not all of it. And then, of course, you have the design, the look and feel of your content in a particular context, how it's going to look in the desktop versus how it's going to look in the mobile app versus how it's going to look in virtual reality, if you go that route, or augmented reality, or whatever your delivery channel may be. Okay, I'm emphasizing this, and maybe some people don't agree with me, but you should never have anything to do with design inside of Contentful. We're not storing design in Contentful at all. Okay, context. This is where your content will be displayed. Part of this can be in Contentful. So for example, you could put some rules in Contentful for each object that says, I don't want these fields to appear on the desktop version, or I don't want it to appear in Alexa, right? Because it doesn't make sense for it to appear in Alexa. So you could put some of these rules, the context rules, in Contentful, but it's going to be very minimal. Content model. So this is your overall architecture of the entire model, right? All your objects put together, the relationships, the attributes, everything, that's what makes up your content model. Content type. A content model is made up of multiple content types. So this is what Contentful calls objects, right? You can think of them as objects, whatever, modules, whatever you want to call them, but basically they're content types. A bunch of content types will make up your whole content model. So for example, a content type may be an article. It could also be a book author. It could be a content type of SEO. It could be release notes. It could be a variety of things. So you create content types, and content types will usually include fields. It may also include other content types within it, and those are usually called assemblies. And we'll get into that in just a minute. Inside your content types is where you have all your fields. And fields hold information. That's where, for example, in a blog article content type, we'll have a field of type short text that could be the title. And it could have a rich text field that allows you to enter the body of it. And it can have a content type of SEO that allows you to enter SEO information. It could have another content type that references a blog author. So those are your fields. Fields themselves will have attributes. So attributes you use to configure those fields. So for example, do you want this field to be required? You want to limit the length of the string in this field, right? So you want it to be no more than 100 characters, but maybe no less than 20. There's a variety of attributes depending on the field that you can configure within Contentful. And this is all part of your content governance that you're going to figure out. And we'll get into content governance as well, but it's very important. References in Contentful are basically links between two or more content types, right? So a blog article has a reference to an author or to many authors. So if you can attach an author object to a blog article, it has a one-to-one relationship or a one-to-one reference. But if you can attach many authors to a blog article, you have a one-to-many relationship. So that means you can have many authors in the blog article, which in some articles, right, you can have more than one author. Makes sense. So field types, I kind of touched upon that a little bit earlier, describe the kind of information you will accept in that field. So for example, you can have a field that's a decimal field. It will only accept decimal numbers, right? You can have a field that's a rich text, and you can accept bold and italic. You can underline. You can do a whole bunch of stuff with it. You can do with a rich text field. You can have a short text. I mean, Contentful offers a variety of field types. And as you create your content model, when you get down to this detail level, which you will, you're going to have to figure that out to provide the best field type, right? To hold the right amount or the right data. And then at the end, when you have all of this figured out, your authors are going to start entering information. The entering of that information is the entry. That's the content inside of the content type. So authors will create all those entries. You also can have assets. Assets are going to be media assets, right? Like, for example, PDFs, audio files, video files, whatever kinds of assets you want to have. All of that will reside inside of Contentful. And asset is actually a type of field you can add to a content type. Now, content types are also known as topics, and those are basically, topics are content types that hold content. That differs than content types that are called assemblies. And those content types reference other content types inside of it. And usually we'll mainly describe that logical grouping that I mentioned about layout, the grouping or the layout order of its content. So for example, we can have a content type photo album, which would be considered an assembly because it references another content type called photo, but it gives it a one-to-many relationship. So it allows the ability to have multiple photos in that photo album, and it allows the content author to also move the order around of the photo. So we can have photo 1, 2, 3, and then 7, 8, and then 5, 6 in that order displayed. But it allows the author to move those things around. So that would be called an assembly. The photo album is an assembly, which holds another content type. And it's used mainly to group all these photos together and allow the user or the author to change the order of that. In Contentful, you have what they call fixed assemblies and flexible assemblies. Fixed assemblies are one-to-one relationships. For example, if we do a blog article that has only one author and we reference the author content type and we only say, hey, it's a fixed assembly, that means they can only enter one author and that's it. If we make it a flexible assembly, that's going to be a one-to-many relationship. So I can add multiple authors and then I can move those authors around, order them in the way I want to. That's more of a flexible assembly. Okay, so structured content. This is information that is organized, and this is what you're going to end up with, right, in your content modeling. You're going to end up with structured content, and this is information that is organized in a predictable way and is self-describing. And this is really important because as a human, I should be able to pick up a structured document, look at it, and not only understand the information in it, but understand the structure of it, right? So I should be able to look at it and go, oh, okay, this is the title. This is the body of it. This is the author. This is sort of the published date. This is the updated date, because there's information in there about that content that tells me what that content is, not just the content itself, right? So that means that we can, as humans, read that and understand the content in it and understand each piece of that content because it tells us about itself. And that's important because when you start coding and you bring information in, then you can use that through code to be able to build relationships, right? And you can pull information from one structured content to another structured content, build relationships, and display things the way you want to. Then you can bring that content into other systems, right? Because everything is structured and it tells you about itself. So that's really important to understand about structured content. It has to be self-describing. Then, of course, unstructured content is totally the opposite of that, right? It's everything else. It's not organized. It's not self-describing. It's not easy to search because I can't do a quick search for, hey, give me all blog articles written by Marcelo Lewin, because if it's unstructured, there's not going to be an object called author that has my name in it. It's probably going to have a field called, let's say, author with a value Marcelo Lewin, but maybe in another article, I mistyped it and put Marcelo with 2 L's instead of 1 L. So now when I say, give me all documents by Marcelo Lewin with 1 L, I would miss a couple that have 2 L's. But if I structure it properly and say that, okay, for the author, that's going to be an object, and I create that object once, I can use that object in all my articles, and I can say, hey, give me all articles that have the object Marcelo Lewin in it. That's the author. And boom, I get them all. And I can easily go into the object Marcelo Lewin and update it. So content governance, that's basically the rules and guidelines that describe how content gets created and published. Not only do you have a content model, but you're also going to have to figure out, hey, what are the rules here? This will include constraints on your fields. Remember, I talked to you about, this field needs to have a minimum of 5 characters and a maximum of 20 characters. Also, which content author has the ability to do what? Are there approval workflows that we need to implement? Can a content author directly publish to production, or does it have to go to an editor? The editor has to approve it. Can the editor then publish, or does it have to be approved by somebody in legal? There's all these things that you have to figure out. That's your governance. And every content model may have a different governance. You want to make sure you have someone in your team that truly understands both the content and the audience of that content, and more importantly, how that content is currently being used and how potentially it will be used. That's really important to have somebody that has that domain knowledge, because if you don't, it'll be very hard to answer questions and create a good scalable content model. I do believe it's extremely important to have a developer or some sort of architect that can see the big picture to help identify any potential issues with the design of that model beyond your current objective, whatever your current objective may be. So for example, your current objective may be, hey, we just want to take this old release note article that we have in this archaic system and put it into Contentful. Well, that's great. But an architect, and I'll show you what I mean by that because I was acting as that architect, will look at the bigger picture and go, hey, are we going to use this information anywhere else? And if we are, then let's look at breaking it apart into pieces that allow for that, okay? So it's really important to have that kind of person, somebody technical. Have somebody that's familiar with your company's content strategy, because you want to make sure that whatever content model you're creating works with your company's overall content strategy. You don't want to go against that. Also, you want to have somebody that really understands the rules of what you're building here, right? Because you need to identify those constraints and workflows. You need to know, for example, I worked with the manager of documentation, and she knew exactly what that workflow should be like. Who needs to approve prior to publishing? What are some of the minimum characters that are required in certain fields and the maximum characters, and so on and so forth. So make sure you have somebody like that in your team. My recommendation, keep it as small as possible. Just have the required team members and keep it as small as possible, because that's how you're going to keep it nimble, and you're also going to want to make sure that everybody that's in that team is very open-minded, because you're going to have people coming in that team going like, well, no, let's design the website how it looks first, and then we go from there. And, you want to take a step back, and also they're going to want to, well, how about putting HTML tags in there? Can I put HTML tags in that rich text field? Well, no, you don't want to do that, because we're keeping the design and we're keeping the layout completely separate from the content itself. Otherwise, we can't reuse this content, right? So that's really important to do that. So try to keep the team as small as possible. Each of you are going to have a variety of objectives for building this content model, but there are some objectives that I think we all need to have, regardless of what your company objectives are. I think when you're building a content model, you're moving away from unstructured content into structured content. You want to build this content model where it allows for single source of truth. And what do I mean by that? Single source of truth means that I enter the information in one place and I can reference it in many other places. And if I made a mistake where I'm referencing it, I can just update that one single source of truth, and the other places that are referencing that information automatically inherits or displays the correct information. So for example, we have blog article. I write 100 blog articles, let's say, right? In my blog article, I have a name, my name, Marcelo Lewin. Now, if I set it up as a field, just a standard field where I type in Marcelo Lewin, and then I realize, of course, this wouldn't happen because I know how to spell my name, but I realize that I misspelled it. I put 2 L's. And I have 100 articles. Now I have to go into every single one of those 100 articles and change it everywhere. But if I would have made it as an object of type author, that author has a first name, last name, email address, whatever. And then in my blog article, I reference that content type author, then it would display all the information coming from that object. Now I can go back into Marcelo, the instance of that object, which is Marcelo Lewin, and I can change the name, and all the 100 articles would automatically display the correct information. That's single source of truth, is the ability to create a piece of information and use it in multiple places without duplicating that information, which allows for scalability and ease of maintenance. We want to keep complete separation of content, context, layout, and design. I don't need to explain what each of those are because we have the vocabulary, which we did already, right? But you want to make sure you keep all that completely separate. You want to have the maintenance and scalability. I explained already maintenance, right? The ability to update, and that comes with single source of truth, the ability to maintain content very easily. Scalability. What do I mean by scalability? Let's say, for example, and I'm going to show you actually because I do have it, we have an SEO object that I add to other objects because I want certain objects to have the ability to add metadata for SEO. And in that SEO object, I have a title, I have a description, and some keywords. Now, a month later, marketing comes to me and goes, we need to start adding Facebook graph data. We need to start adding Twitter metadata because we really want it to be there. Let's say we use SEO in 4 or 5 different content types, and I used them as fields instead of objects. I would have to go again into those 4 or 5 content types and add new fields and then populate it, where instead of creating an SEO object and all these other content types inherit that object, right? So they reference that object. I can now add more fields to that object, and all of a sudden, all the other content types that are referencing that object will get these new fields immediately. It won't break your code either because the code doesn't know about those fields existing, which means that you can update your code to start using those fields as well. But it makes it scalable that way, right? You didn't completely destroy your content model because all you did is update the model of one object, added 3 fields, and then all the other objects that are just referencing that object automatically have access to that information. So that gives you a scalability. And then omni-channel delivery flexibility. By doing all of this, you can now deliver into multiple channels because you've designed it properly. And you want to be able to integrate content with other internal or external systems. Maybe today you don't, but you just never know if in the future you're going to want to take this content and go, you know what? We could use this information in Salesforce to connect it to a customer and build a really nice picture here of that customer and the content they use, let's say. Also, improving authoring experience, right? You want to make it easy for your authors. You want to make it a pleasant experience for your authors. They're going to be there 8 to 10 hours a day. You want to make sure you design this properly so it's not a major pain in the you-know-what for them to enter information. And you want to help improve discoverability of the content by, again, breaking it down, single source of truth, having objects that are referencing other objects. You improve that discoverability of content. Let's talk about creating content governance. So there are 2 things you want to do. There's the roles and permissions, and then there's tasks. So for roles, you're going to create some roles basically, right? You're going to have like an author, and it's not exactly what you may do. It may be what you want to do. You can create as many roles as you want, but you can have an author, for example, and the author has write and edit permissions, but not publish, right? They can only write and edit, but they can't publish. But the editor can do all of it, right? They can write, edit, and publish. You may also have legal, and legal can only read and then deny or approve that content. And then you want to decide on tasks. And what I mean by tasks is what tasks are needed to be completed before a content type can be published. So for example, you may say, hey, when anybody creates a blog article, I want to make sure these 3 tasks are completed. One of them is, hey, make sure SEO is completed fully. Make sure that there is an image. Make sure the URL is friendly. I don't know. It could be a variety of tasks, but you can have in Contentful, you can have it where whenever you create a content type, and this requires a little bit of development. It's not out of the box. You have to do it through development, but you can do it. But you can have when somebody creates a blog article, automatically tasks are created and they're assigned to themselves. So That's the next thing. Who can be in charge of completing those tasks? And how can we verify that those tasks have been completed? Do we do it programmatically? Does it have to be approved by a person? Do they have to check it? So on and so forth. So that's part of your governance that you want to figure out as part of your content model, because that's extremely important, right? You don't want authors just publishing stuff without an editor approval if that is the workflow that's required. All right, so now we're going to jump into the demonstration. But before I do that, I'm just going to give you the process that I went through. What we did is we picked a document to structure. And in this case, we have a variety of documents in our knowledge base website. One of them is called release notes. So we decided, okay, let's start with that. We went and looked at it. We learned all about the document's information. Where is that document coming from? How is it entered? How is it put together? Then we brainstormed via Miro, which is an online app that you can do brainstorming, mind mapping, and broke down the document. And I'm going to show you that. Then we created an entity relationship diagram. This is where we get to see the relationships, and then I had that reviewed with the team. Once it was approved, I created the content model for Contentful and have that reviewed in the team. Now, this wasn't done in Contentful itself. This was done in a diagram. Then after it was approved, I created the basic content model inside of Contentful, but I didn't add any constraints because at this point, I want to make sure the content model works within Contentful and also the authoring experience works within Contentful. So I had the docs manager review that and approve it, and we made any changes. Then what I did is I created a content type detail spreadsheet that allows the team to look at all the fields, all the objects, and then start telling me what are some of the constraints, because they know the content the best. And those constraints are what I need to put into the content model. So then I went and took those constraints and updated the content model with those constraints inside of Contentful. I had it approved by the docs manager and the team. And then we had a developer create a preview for that content type, because you want to be able to allow your authors to preview the content prior to publishing, right? And then I opened up the content model for the authors to start testing. So in other words, they can start adding content, they can start previewing it and seeing how it is. So let's jump into the documents. So this is a knowledge-based document that we have. And you can see that this document is release notes. Every time we update our app, we create a release notes, just like you see in any other kind of app, right? Web app or anything. They tell you what's new, what's improved, and what's being fixed. By looking at this document, as I scroll down, you can see that there's a title, there's an about this release. We have here some breadcrumb, right? I'm not looking at the navigation because that's for all documents. We're just concentrating on the document itself here, the release note. We see that there's a table of content. Also, then as we go down, we see that we have new features, improved features, and fixed features. We also have some PDFs that may be available, maybe some videos, some other media here. And then we have this widget that they can say, was this helpful or not? The people that read, the users, our end users, when they read this, they can say, was this helpful or not? And then there's a footer, okay? So we kind of analyzed it, right? And I could quickly go and like, oh, you know what? This is going to be easy. Let me just create a content type as a title and about, and let's just create 3 rich text fields. It'll be a new rich text field, an improvement rich text field, and then a fixes rich text field. And then they can go in there and go all crazy and just enter this however they want. We could do that. That would be pretty easy. That would be like literally 5 minutes to do, but then it wouldn't solve a lot of the issues that we want, which is having structure and be able to identify the document itself to be self-describing, right? Because if I have a rich text field here, it's like, I don't know what happens. I know that new stuff goes in here, but I don't know, what is this? I don't know what that is. I don't know what this is. How do we let them put links? I don't know any of that. So we have to go in a little bit deeper. And that's where once we kind of understood the overall format of this document, we went into and started brainstorming it. So here, I'm going to show you, is that document. This is an app called Miro that we use in my work. So here's the document. I just brought the document in here. And then we go, okay, look, we have a release notes, okay? Now, one thing you need to do is we're going to separate. Remember, we're completely dividing the content from the layout or the design. So, okay, if we have release notes, let's talk about content only right now. We know we have to do something about layout, but we know that layout really doesn't belong in Contentful, and we're not going to model that. So let's just talk about the content. All right. So here's the content, and there's going to be content that's populated by Contentful, but I know we have content that's going to come from other systems. So as an example, I know that Was This Helpful is a widget that comes from another system called Pendo. So I wanted to make sure that, we break that apart. So let's stick with the stuff that we're going to do with content authors. So I hope I'm not making everybody dizzy, but I'm moving back and forth. So we have a release note. Here we have a title, we have about, and then we have features, right? So here we go, we have a title, we have about, but then we have features. So we have a new feature, an improved feature, and a fixed feature. These are kind of sections. But I know that, or I know after, of course, some research and speaking with the docs manager, that these are modules in our app, like CRM APIs, invoicing, call booking. Those are all modules in our application, web app. And each module has a variety of features. So the call booking module, under improvement, this was a feature. Under customer communications, this was another feature. So then now we know that feature section can hold many modules, and each module can have many features. So you can see 1, 2 to X, right? Depends. So now we broke it down a little bit more. So now we're able to really describe this document. Instead of having 3 rich text fields, right, that allows the user to enter whatever they want here, we know that we have 3 sections. One is going to be new, improved, and fixed. But within there, we know that we have modules, multiple modules. And within the modules, we know that we can have multiple features. So if I go back to the document, you can see here under improvements, right, this is the section improvements. This is the module dispatch. And here we have multiple features, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, 4 features right here, right? So we know we have that. So going back to this diagram, we're covering for that. So, okay, we broke it down a bit more. That's good. Let's look at the other content that I know we're not going to update through Contentful, just because we don't need to. For example, the breadcrumb, that's automatic. That'll be done through coding. Table of content, that's going to be automatic too. That'll be done through coding. Why is that? Because I can easily go and tell Contentful, hey, go to the content type release notes and give me all the release notes that we have and display just the names here. Boom, we're done. So that's done through content, through code itself. So we don't need to create an object to hold table of content. The helpful widget, as I mentioned before, it's going to come through Pendo. So again, we don't need to hold it. And the footer message, it's the same for everybody. You could make an argument that you want that to be able to be changed, but since this is the same for everybody, I decided just to put it as part of hard-coded. But you could make an argument to let the authors change that. But I'm making it where you don't. All right, so we have the content figured out here. I mean, we got this document broken down into all its core pieces. We really can't go any more granular in feature. You really can't. Well, we will in the sense that we'll have fields, right? So this feature, which is here, will have a title, which is what's bold, and then we'll have a body for it, which is the feature itself, the content of that feature, correct? So we'll do that. Okay, so for the layout, we know that we're going to basically display it exactly like this. We're not changing for the sake of argument, we're not changing the design, okay? So I know that code is going to decide where everything fits. I'm going to allow the code because we want that clear separation. The breadcrumb, the title, the about, table, new feature section, the layout of all of this is going to be decided by the code and by the designer, right? When you sit down with the designer and you figure it out, then the coder will implement it. However, I do want the authors to have the power to move call booking, let's say down here, and customer notifications up there. So I want them to, even though I want to give them the flexibility to reorder these. And if modules have multiple features, I want them to also have the flexibility to move those features around. So going back to this document that has multiple features, let's say the author wants to put dispatch up here, but then also wants to put technicians above time off shifts, right? And bring this below. So we want the ability from a layout perspective to allow our authors to move modules and to move features within modules. So looking at the layout here, I'm saying the layout will be managed by code. All of this will be managed by code, like where everything appears. But within those sections, so the module position within features, so we're talking about these 3 features, that should be allowed within Contentful to reorder them. Same with feature positions within modules. And then we have media, right? So this section, I know I want it to be here always. But within this section, we can have multiple media. I want them to be able to order that. So now, if you look at this, and I'm going to go a little bit smaller so we can see the whole thing. Everything in pink or red, whatever that color is going to be managed by Contentful. So you can easily see both content and layout, what it is that we're going to put in Contentful, and the rest of it we're going to ignore, right? And this part here, regardless if this document will look like this or not, it doesn't matter because we can change it completely. We can have the breadcrumb be on the right-hand side. We can have the table of content be on the left, right? The code will decide with the designer and other people involved in designing that layout. It will be decided via the code. But regardless if we put the section to the right or on top or below, we'll be able to still move these around because we have the power in there, okay? So that's your brainstorming session. The next step is to create the actual entity relationships diagram. And this is where we take all of that information, right, that we showed here, all of this information, and now start figuring out, okay, what is an object? What's going to be an object? What is the relationship between features and modules and sections, right? We have to figure that out. So after looking at all that, here I brought in the document here again, and just so it's easy to tie, we have an object called release notes. That's the topmost object. That object will hold a title, which is this here. It'll hold an about, which is this here. It's going to have a version, which is metadata describing the version, and a release date, which is also metadata. It doesn't show anywhere, but it'll hold it. Remember, we talked about references. It's going to hold an SEO metadata, which is going to be a reference to another object. This object will hold title, description, and keywords. Remember, we can say later, we can add Facebook keywords, Facebook title, and this object here, release notes, will automatically inherit all that if we add it later. But we know that in the release notes, we're going to want to add some metadata, some SEO metadata. We also know that the release notes has media, right? So we want to allow the ability to add multiple media. Now, there is an actual content type called media in Contentful. Actually, it's a field type. And you can add it in there into the release notes. But what I did, and you'll see when I actually go to the next step, which is building the object model in Contentful, I actually created a custom content type of media because the built-in media type is very limited in Contentful, where it only allows you to add a title, a description, and the actual file, whereas I wanted to add some alt text and maybe some other metadata. So you can create a content type that holds media, but you can add as much metadata as you want to it. But anyway, we're going to have media, and then there's the system itself will tell us when it was updated, right? So that's release notes right here. This is the object of release notes. Now, release notes has many features. So a feature has a title. So if we look at a title, that's this here, Map 2.0 Beta. It also has a summary, like here, the rest of it, right? So link forms to equipment would be the title. You can now link forms, blah, 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 blah. All of that is the description. I also added a summary because I wanted to have the ability to use this in other systems and maybe have a shorter version of this description. So I'll show you later. It also has an update type. And what do I mean by update type? Well, this feature is either going to be new, improved, or fixed. And this is how the code will know where to put this feature, right? If we said this feature is of type new, it'll add it under in the new section. It also has a reference to metadata, so we can add metadata to this feature, right? So I'll have title, description, keywords, and remember, later on, if we add Facebook or whatever else metadata, this will inherit it. Okay, now features, how do we get features to appear under dispatch or forms? Well, those are components, right? App modules. What I did is I actually created, call it an app component, but we'll have a component object that'll hold the name, maybe a description of it, an ID for that component, and the context. Context being, is this component for the web app or is it for the mobile app? And then maybe later on, is it for the VR app or is it for the so on and so forth, Alexa app, whatever it is, right? So this is the component. So now we can create a feature, give it a title, which would be like Map 2.0, give it a description, which is this description, do a quick summary of that. Then I can say, hey, this feature belongs to dispatch, and the type is new. So in the front end, right, when we pull it, it'll say, hey, for this new section, give me all modules with all features that are new, and it'll display it here. So now we made this pretty scalable because now we can start querying it. And how do we know it's scalable? And how do we know it'll work for the future? Well, you've got to ask questions of the content model. So even before you implemented anything, and I know this may sound like a lot of work and complicated, and partly it is a lot of work and not really so complicated, but you want to put this work up front because this is what's going to set your content model up for success in the future and for scalability. Because the goal here is not only to have a great content model, but later on, 5 years from now, hopefully we don't really need to change the content model itself much. Even if we went through 10 iterations of the front end design, the content model really shouldn't change that much. So what kind of questions can we ask this content model? So for example, from the help side, can we say, hey, give me all the latest release notes? Well, yeah, we can. We can say, hey, we can go to this object and go, hey, Contentful, give me all the release notes, period. Okay, so we have that. Can we say, give me all the release notes for this date? Well, yeah, we can because we have a release date. So we can say, hey, give me all release notes as of this date and later. Can we say, show me all new features for a particular release? Well, yeah, we can. We can say, hey, go to release note version 2.0, pull all the features that are of type new. Okay, so we could do that. So you can see that I created a variety of questions with the team, right? We all came up with these questions and then asked the content model before we even implemented in Contentful, before we even get a developer to create anything, ask the content model, hey, can I get all these questions? Because if you don't, you're going to miss something. Another thing is we have an in-app widget, and then we also have in-app content for certain areas in the app. So can I say, show me all new features for this particular module? Well, yeah, because I can go to the component and say, hey, for this component ID, show me all features of type new. Boom, I get them. So then I can show that in the app. If I'm in a widget, I can say, show me the latest release notes with a summary for each feature. So now I can say, okay, go give me the latest release notes, but because we're in in-app, and in-app is a very small window, we don't have a lot of information we can display. For all the features, instead of giving me the full description, give me the summary. And that was the point of that, is to have the summary, right? So build a list of questions you want to ask your content model before you move forward on creating anything else, and make sure those are answered for you. So the next step here is creating the Contentful model itself. What I've ended up doing is created a release notes object or content type. Remember, they're called content types in Contentful. And then I got into a little bit more of the details. So for example, I have all the fields that are going to be in that content now. So now we have all the fields with all the type of fields that they are, and a description of what's expected in each of those fields. So for release notes, we have a title, about, release version, date release, as we mentioned up there. But we have SEO metadata, which is a reference to here, the SEO metadata. We also have media asset, which is a reference to the media asset content type right there. We have new features, improved features, and fixed features, which is really just a reference to component and product features. So we can add here, we can add a component. So we can say, hey, let's add, I'll show you what I mean. Let's add the call booking component, and under that, let's add these 3 features. So that's the release note. So this is now an actual content model that can be implemented or created inside of Contentful. And like I mentioned to you before, I went and then took this model. I spoke with the documentation team and manager and made sure that this was approved for their needs, right? After they reviewed it, they said, yeah. So then the next step was for me to go ahead and create that model inside of Contentful. So here we are in Contentful, content model here. And you can see you have the 5 components, the same components that I created here, release notes, media asset, app component, product feature, and SEO. They are now in Contentful. So if I go into app component, you can see that I've added all the correct fields. Within the fields, I have the correct validations or constraints, the way they should appear, all of that. Actually, before I added all those constraints, what I did is I just created the content model, created all of those objects, added all the references, and then I went into content and I showed, again, the team, hey, this is the way this is going to look. And what they do, and I'm going to go here, release notes. They went ahead and used it to create one release notes just to test to see if this works. So when we click on release notes, this is what the author sees now, right? So you can see they add a title. Here's the about. It's a rich text field. Release version. When it was released. Then this is SEO metadata. Now look at this. This is a reference to that SEO object. So when I click on this, there are the 3 fields. So for example, let's say I go into the content model. I'm going to go to the SEO metadata. I'm going to add a new field. I'm going to call it text, or I'm going to be of type text, and I'm going to say Facebook description. Let's just say that for now. We'll say it's a short text. We'll say create. We'll leave it like that. We'll save this. I'm going to go back to the content, release notes. I'm going to go back now to SEO. I'm going to click on that and look at this. That's how it becomes scalable. Now, all of this information is filled out, and all I have to do is add this extra information. Of course, I misspelled that, but that's okay. No worries. So what I'm going to do, if I don't forget later, I'm going to go back into SEO. I'm going to okay, so I just deleted it, and we're good. We're back to normal. I hope that was pretty clear there. Let's go back to SEO, to the release notes, I mean. As I scroll down, remember we have media assets, and it's a one-to-many relationship. So I was able to add assets here, many assets. So when I click on it, when I click on this asset, it'll open it up and it'll show you that reference to that object, which allows me to enter a title, an alternate title, a description, and the actual asset itself. Later on, if I want to add more metadata to this, to images, let's say, I can add more here to this object, and when we go back in, it'll be there, just like we did with SEO. And as we go down, you'll see that we have a section called New Features, Improve Features, and Fix Features. They're all referencing the same feature content type. So when we go to the content model, you have product feature. All of them are referencing this. So when we go here, you can see if I just select one that I added, we can add multiple things here. We can add a component and a feature. Remember, in our release notes, we have component and then we have features. And I want to be able to let them move the component up and down or the feature up and down. So if we go back, here's a component, here's a product feature, here's another component, here's another product feature. Let's go ahead and link an existing feature. We're going to duplicate here, but we're going to go product feature, and we'll add map 2.0, let's say. So now under app component, we have two product features, one that's link forms to equipment and map 2.0 beta. Under the dispatch, we have map 2.0 beta. So now, let's say they say, you know what, I really want this up here, but I want to move this component with its features down here. Okay, so now on the front end, you're going to have this app component appear under new features, this app component appear under that one. This is where you have the flexible assemblies that partly allow you to control the layout. That's why I said part of the layout you're able to control within Contentful. All it does, it's telling you, I want it to be in this order, right? The layout. What's going to dictate how it really looks here, that's going to be your CSS and your code and your designer and all of that. It's not going to be Contentful. Okay, so then I can say publish changes. Oh yeah, there's individual errors because I have constraints on them that I haven't met. But right here, this is please provide between 20 and 300 items. So I'm going to go ahead and not worry about this right now. Let me go back. So that is that object model inside of Contentful itself. And I let them play with it. Once they approved it, then I went and said, okay, we need to really add constraints for every object. So I created the spreadsheet that by object for it's a content type details for the release notes, right? And remember, release notes, we have 5 content types. Release notes, which is the main one, app component, media asset, product feature, and SEO metadata. So I in this spreadsheet, the team went in and then started filling out. I filled out this part, which of course they're not aware of. I put it in there, but we needed to know, hey, is this a required field? Does the value need to be unique? What kind of values can you accept? Like, for example, here we only want images, audio, videos, and PDF documents, nothing else. Should there be a minimum characters, a maximum characters? Are there any patterns that you want to enforce? For example, if this field is zip code, do you want it to be the 5 digits, or do you want it to be the 5 digits with a dash and the 4 digits, so on and so forth? So this is sort of the constraint spreadsheet that I provided to them. Once this was filled out, then I went back to Contentful itself, and then object by object in the content model, clicked on every object, and then went in and clicked on settings and set up all the validations, obviously. So, and then finally, what I want to show you is once you have all this information here, so let's go back to content. So once we have this, and we don't have a production version that I can show you right now, right, to show you this, but I do want to show you. Once you click on publish, the ultimate delivery for the delivery channels currently that we're planning on doing are two things. One of them is going to be this one, which is the actual, they would get the same document right now. So instead of this being just a standard HTML page, it would have been created now by Contentful. So now we're ready to change the front end whenever we want and not worry about figuring out where do we pull content from, because it's all broken down already properly. But the other delivery channel is in the app itself. So for example, here in the dispatch board, right? For example, say, hey, give me all the new features for the dispatch board. So here's, for example, this is made up. This is not how we're doing it because this is very ugly. But here's a pop-up that would appear, let's say, and says, hey, version ST41, right? That's coming from, if we go back to our, if we go back here, that would be release version. So we can say ST41, and in fact, I'll go to the next slide because the next slide tells you the release notes title field. This is the app component name. This is the product feature title. And this is the product feature short description, right? Because we don't want the full description here. So you can see how I'm using the features and the modules only in the app, but in the release notes, we're using everything, right? And we're using the type, we're using the about, the title of that. So this can only be done because now we have a scalable content model that allows us to take this information and display it in various delivery channels in different manners, and it doesn't matter what that front end is. The next content delivery channel could be Alexa, where we tell Alexa, maybe we created a skill that says, hey, Alexa, can you tell me what's new in the dispatch board for this app? And it could just read all the stuff out. So with that, that's it. That's all I have for you guys. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed it. Feel free to send me an email. You can look me up on Twitter. I'm everywhere. And you can find all of my social media located at the footer of themarcelolewin.com. Everything is there. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you being here. Cheers, everybody.